Welcome to the Golf Improvement Podcast, episode 79.
Welcome to the podcast for golf lovers and enthusiasts who are looking to take their games to new heights. Dedicated to custom club fitting, short game improvement, and effective practice to improve your golf game. This is the Golf Improvement Podcast with your host, Tony Wright.
Hello, this is Tony Wright from Game Improvement Golf in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, with the Golf Improvement Podcast, dedicated to bringing you useful information on custom club fitting, short game improvement, and effective practice techniques to take your game to new heights. Well, surely you can tell this morning that I have a bit of a cold, so I won't be talking a lot today, and going to try to not to talk a lot during the interview. My wife and I have been away on a four-city vacation trip, so I wasn't able to publish my podcast during the normal Monday time that I do it. But I know you'll enjoy my discussion with a good friend, Dr. Brandon Horvath, a golf turf pathologist from the University of Tennessee's Department of Turfgrass Science and Management. Enjoy this interview. Hello, this is Tony Wright with the Golf Improvement Podcast, and I'm excited today to interview somebody who's become a very good friend, Dr. Brandon Horvath, who is a turf pathologist, who is an assistant professor of turfgrass science in the University of Tennessee Department of Turfgrass Science and Management. Brandon is also a very avid golfer, I think about a 5 handicap right now, Brandon. Isn't that correct?
Yep, that's right. 5.4 index.
Wanting to get better all the time. Spends a lot of time on Twitter and things like that, trying to learn from all the people there. But we're going to talk golf turf today, which is, a little different, but I think it's going to be a lot of fun. I think we've both been looking forward to doing this. So, Brandon, thanks a lot for doing this with me today.
Thanks, Tony. It's great to be on, and it's a great opportunity for me to share a little bit about what we do on the business side with all the folks that listen to your podcast that maybe are a little more interested in how you play the game. And I think it's a great opportunity to expose them to some of the things that we think about in terms of how do we manage those surfaces so that they play as good as they can play.
Well, we all love to play, right? And everybody wants to do is talk about, well, why isn't this and why isn't that? So we'll understand a lot of the mechanics of trying to keep things done in terms of all the types of turf to help us all enjoy the game better. So, you have a PhD in turfgrass science and especially in research related to managing turfgrass diseases. So that's a little bit different career path than a lot of people do. Talk a little bit about how you got interested in that field and specialty.
Okay, so one of the things that's interesting about most of the folks in our field is that we all have a fairly similar story, at least to this point. We're at the University of Tennessee. We're trying to expose folks to what we do so that we can recruit new students. But I think in the past, the traditional way that somebody got into this field was that, for me, I was a pharmacy major. I was transferring schools from Butler University to the Ohio State University. And that summer, I had considered going out for the Butler golf team with some of my fraternity brothers that played on the team, convinced me that I could play. And so I had gotten kind of serious about my game, and then my parents let me know that they were going to have me transfer because Butler was a private school and was expensive. So I was working at a driving range, and I was working on my game. It was kind of a reason to the working at the driving range was a reason to practice more than anything else.
Yeah.
And I met a golf course superintendent, and he was an assistant golf course superintendent at Kenwood Country Club in Cincinnati, and we started talking, and he said, well, if you like chemistry and science and those kinds of things, and you like to play golf, you'd love this job. And I was like, okay. And he said, why don't you come to work with me one day? And so I did the next morning, and I had never been on a private country club before. And so to see, how nice that was compared to every other golf course I had ever been on was just amazing. And I was instantly hooked. I mean, I went home and proudly told my dad, this is what I'm going to do, and started making inroads about how to switch my major and all that kind of stuff. And my dad kind of took that, a lot like Ted Knight and Caddyshack with the world needs ditch diggers.
Yeah, right. Another thing to do, right? Or another idea or something.
Yeah. And it wasn't until he talked a couple of weeks later to his doctor, and the doctor said, well, we pay our superintendent nearly six figures, that he came home and was, okay with my choice, that I was actually going to be able to make a living. And so that's how I got into the field. And almost everybody that I talk with has some variation on that story. It's not something that's highly visible. Yeah. In fact, most golf course superintendents and most athletic field managers, the thing that they want the most is to not be talked about, because if you're not talking about the golf course and you're not talking about the athletic field that the football game is being played on, then that's a great thing.
Yeah. Do you still correspond with the guy that kind of was your inroad to that?
I've fallen out of touch with him. I stay in touch. I run into classmates that I went to school with at Ohio State. It's a fairly small club. I'm not sure that he's still in the business. His name was Marcus Lasinick. And if Marcus is listening, then please get in touch with me. That'd be great, because I'd love to reconnect with him.
Yeah, we all have they're big people in our backgrounds who kind of steered us somewhere,
Oh, absolutely.
It's kind of neat.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. Well, we're going to talk about, all of the elements of golf courses, or at least a lot of them, sort of the big three, I'm guessing. So let's start talking in the beginning about some of the important factors that make greens play great, but then also help them to be healthy, because if they play great for 2 weeks and then they're not healthy, that's not really going to help anybody, right? I'm sure there's a lot more, everybody thinks about green speed as sort of one of the big things, but there must be a lot more to it than that.
There is, and it's one of the things that a lot of us laugh about is the mindset that, well, if I have a nice lawn, then I could easily maintain, Augusta National's putting surfaces. And it's kind of like that, but it's a lot more complex and a lot more detailed than having a nice lawn, because for one, you're dealing with not just being out in the environment and the environmental extremes, but you're also dealing with the traffic stress of having several hundred golfers come through each day, having to recover that stress, having to make sure that the surface remains healthy and viable. And so there's a number of things that affect how a grass, and the other thing is you're dealing with, literally millions of living plants. I mean, that's what a putting surface is, if it's a natural grass surface, and you're dealing with maintaining those plants at generally today at mowing heights that are somewhere between 1/10 of an inch and 1/8 of an inch. And so if you just stop and think about trying to keep a plant alive at that you're clipping every day at literally 1/10 of an inch, it's not hard to imagine that seems to be a bit challenging. And I think the major factors that make surfaces play great, and this is one of the things we tell our students all the time: you don't have to play golf to be a golf course superintendent. To be a very good golf course superintendent, you don't have to play golf. But playing golf helps inform you. Even if you don't play well, it helps inform you about more than just the science of maintaining the plants. It helps you inform you about what's important from the player's perspective. And it affects your perspective as well. So for me, as a player, I think about greens, first off, that roll smoothly, more than speed. I'm a good player. I can adjust my putting to account for the speed. But if the ball's bouncing literally all over the place, and I can't count on the fact that if I roll it on a line that it's going to generally roll in the direction of the hole, then that becomes very challenging and frustrating. And I think when we get to some other things, we'll touch on, or I'll touch on some because I say bouncing all over the place, and immediately what comes to mind for most people is aerification. But that is a completely different thing to talk about in terms of how it affects the ball roll, because I think it actually affects the ball roll very little, even though there's some visible bouncing. But the surface needs to be smooth. The green speeds need to be, reasonable, but I think there's a trade-off, and this is one of the things that's challenging is when golfers go from one place to another comparing, what the stimp meter speed is or whatever, that they lose sight of the fact that first off, the stimp meter was developed to compare consistency from green to green to green within a single golf course. Yeah. It was never intended to compare, my golf course is faster than your golf course. And that's because, if you play a golf course that has relatively flat greens with not a lot of slope, you can increase the speeds to some very extreme green speeds and not suffer any ill effects. Whereas if you play an older, more classically designed golf course from like the golden era of the architects like Donald Ross's classic golf courses, you go to Pinehurst or you go to Augusta is a good example, and you see the undulations that are present on those surfaces, and you realize very quickly that you're going to lose a tremendous amount of hole locations, and you're going to lose a tremendous amount of green space if you increase green speeds over a certain speed. So it has to be a balancing act between how undulating the surfaces are, and sometimes the undulations allow for the perception of speed. If you're putting downhill, the ball's going to roll out. I just saw a tweet the other day from one of the aim point folks talking about the perceived stimp, or what the stimp meter speed would be on a certain percent slope. And you see numbers up in the 20s when you get up to 2 and 3% slopes. And that's not uncommon on an older golf course that's, more classically designed. So those are the two keys. And so you have to balance the smoothness and speed piece with the health of the grass. And to keep grass healthy, you have to have water, you have to have light, you have to have some fertility, mostly in the form of nitrogen. Those are the kind of the three big things, and you have to mow it regularly, obviously, to make it playable. And if you can have those three things, then you can maintain some pretty nice surfaces, and then it just becomes a management we always talk about it being kind of an art based on science. You're trying to balance those competing interests and also allow for the grass to recover from any damage. So if you have a lot of play, you may have to fertilize a little more aggressively, and that may result in green speeds that are slightly slower than a place that only has 20 rounds a day because they're an ultra private place, and they can keep things really fast without having to recover from a lot of damage. So there's all of these balancing acts that are taking place, and all of that is taking place. And this is the thing that, if that was one thing that a listener could keep in mind, is that all of that's taking place on a surface that's generally maintained between 1/10 and 1/8 of an inch.
Yeah, we never think about that part.
No.
Well, that, excuse me, and as you know, I'm having fun with my cold.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, and that has changed over the last 30 or so years. I mean, I don't even know what the heights were 30 years ago, but it was probably more than 1/8 of an inch, So talk a little bit about how these changes happened over the last 30 or so years in greens, and maybe also where you guys, from what you do, see as the greens of the future, maybe what you're looking at.
Yeah, so I think over the last 30 years, in terms of mowing heights, we've certainly dropped down. The when I started in I became a turfgrass science major and an agronomy major at Ohio State in 1992. So that's 25 years ago. So I've kind of seen this 30-year time frame that you're talking about, and when I first started working, my first golf course turf job that was anything more than being a ball mark repairman. I did that for a little while in when I was in 8th grade and 9th grade, and I lasted a week on the golf course with a blister that ran the length of my thumb. But the first real golf course job that I had was at Scioto Country Club in Columbus, which is where, of course, Jack Nicklaus grew up. And the greens were maintained there around 1/8 of an inch, but they were kind of at the top end. You know, they were one of the cutting edge clubs. I mean, they're a top 100 club. They were one of the places that was pushing that edge. And when I worked at another course in Columbus, our target height was 1/8 of an inch for daily play, but we would often in the summer raise heights to 7/64ths or 5/32 of an inch. And just prior to that, I would say that the average cutting height for like a mid-level golf course was probably about 5/32 of an inch to a quarter of an inch. That was kind of the range. Yeah. And then the high end courses were down at 1/8. There's some, and I've seen it on Twitter a few times recently, people posting some of the published stimp meter speeds that the USGA collected back in the 70s. And you see places like, Augusta and Oakmont. Oakmont had, on one list had the fastest greens on the list, and they were rolling 10.5. And today, at a reasonably, moderate range public golf course, you could expect green speeds around 9.5 to 10. And at a private club, easily 10.5 is achievable for daily play. And a lot of places are up at 11.5. And, the other challenge with this, and particularly with green speed, is that I don't think most golfers have a real appreciation for how much more fun the game would be if you could not have to worry about 3-putting all the time.
Oh, yeah, right.
And it's not to say that we need to go back to greens that you have to strike a putt rather than stroke a putt, that you actually have to hit it. But I think that we would go a lot farther along trying to make the greens as smooth as possible and focus on green speeds in that 9.5 to 10.5 range on a daily play basis, or maybe even a little slower, 9 to 10. And you would find them to be very comfortable in speed and very playable without always having to worry about that ball just rolling out 3 and 4 and 5 feet past if you don't get the speed just right.
So are there any of the newer grasses and things that are coming along that are sort of amenable to being in that range?
Yeah, I think they're and that, I guess that goes to your question of the kind of what's on the horizon. I think there's a couple of things that are we're starting to see a little bit. I think we're starting to see a little bit more of a push or a desire for greens complexes that are more like what we saw during the Golden Age. I just played a week or so ago down at Sweetens Cove down in the Chattanooga area. Mm-hmm. Beautiful little 9-hole golf course with greens complexes that are very reminiscent of the Golden Age of architecture, Redan holes and double plateaus and things like that, where you have to have lots of undulation, and so you can't have green speeds get out of control, or it would just frankly be, you'd be waiting for the clown car to pull up and and hear the carnival music. It's so you can't have that. And I think there's always a push from from the on the turf grass science side from the breeders to try to make grasses more dense and able to be mowed at lower heights. But I think we're getting kind of, the limit to how high we mow right now is really a function of the thickness of the bed knife on the bottom of the mower, which is kind of the stationary blade. Mowers on putting surfaces kind of mow like a pair of scissors. Mm-hmm. And so the bottom blade that's stationary, and then there's the rotating blades that are called the reel. The stationary blade's called the bed knife. And the real limitation to the mowing height is how thick that bed knife can be manufactured while maintaining its shape, while the reel is spinning at high speed and contacting it. And as you as an engineer certainly know about things like friction and heat and all of those kinds of things generated to warp that metal. And so, those are the things that limit. And so I think we're getting pretty close to the edge of where we conceivably could maintain. I mean, until somebody comes up with a laser mower that doesn't need a bed knife.
That's what I was thinking too, as you were doing that it's something where there's almost an online ability to measure as you're mowing, where you are and automatically adjust. That's going to happen someday, though.
Yeah, and I mean, there are certainly. I think the things that are changing in our industry we're looking at becoming more efficient with our resources, water, fertility, et cetera, and we're also trying to become, better managers of our environment, and I think we do that very well. It's something that we don't talk about. We try to talk about it, but oftentimes we end up preaching to the choir rather than getting the message out. I think we do a tremendous job of taking care of the environment. There's really never been a golf course superintendent that I've met that isn't a huge lover of the outdoors and really likes being outdoors and the natural beauty and wanting to make sure that they leave it in a little better place than they found it.
Yeah.
And I think the only other thing that I'd say on the horizon is given that we're kind of at kind of a bottoming point in terms of how low we're mowing and then the requirements of designing golf courses to account for that, because many golf courses have gone through redesigns to take undulation and elevation change out of their greens and make them flatter to accommodate that higher green speed. I think the pendulum is starting to swing maybe back a little bit. There's certainly some zoysia grasses that are on the horizon, which are different, that can be maintained at greens height. And I think that will allow, because they can't, generally speaking, zoysia grasses just don't provide quite the amount of speed that a Bermuda grass or a bent grass might provide, which are the other two grasses on putting surfaces. And in that situation, I think you can introduce more undulation and bring some of the perceived speed back to the game, and also making it a lot of fun. Like I was saying at Sweetens Cove, I had a shot from off the green. It was a par 5. I was 80 yards out. I hit a little hybrid up into this bank on the left side of the green, literally 60 feet from where the hole was. And the ball went up the hill, kind of trundled down and made its way down towards the hole and ended up stopping 4 feet for birdie. And, the architect, when we visited with him, he said, we like the idea that if you use your imagination and you're creative, that the ball will kind of collect in these areas and give you some opportunities for some birdie putts, because people have fun making birdies. And I just thought that's such a magnificent idea and philosophy, rather than walking home and just feeling like you've been beaten about the head and shoulders. That's fun every once in a while, but it's not fun on a daily play basis.
Yeah, if you're a member there or you play that course all the time. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, Brandon, let's switch a little bit and talk a little bit about fairways, okay? And
sure.
And, I have some ideas about the types of grasses there, but, Bermuda and zoysia and things like that. But, talk about the considerations there and how things have improved, in your sort of career time, right? I mean, 25 years is a good
sure.
element there.
Yeah. On fairways, I think the the pendulum has kind of swung one direction and swung back already in some cases. The challenge with the different grasses that are used in fairways is that we've got to account for somebody that lives in, say, mid Michigan and somebody that lives in southern Florida. So as you move from north to south in the U.S., and we'll just kind of keep it to the U.S. because getting into other countries gets a little more challenging as well. But as you move north to south in the U.S., you basically go from a cool season climate to a warm season climate. And there are grasses that are specialized for both of those environments. And here in Knoxville, Tennessee, where I'm at, and in Oak Ridge, where you're at, we're right kind of in the heart of what's called the transition zone, which is the area where, as we tell our students, you can grow all the grasses equally poorly. And that's because, they both have their weaknesses at various times of the year. And in this transition zone climate, we have both of those kinds of seasons. We have a colder winter, which is what's challenging for a warm season grass, and we have a hotter summer, which is challenging for a cool season grass. So it's a great place to study diseases and study problems on grasses. But in terms of what's used, generally, if we're talking about a cool season golf course, the predominant grass used for fairways today is bent grass. And then, of course, there's the annual bluegrass, which is a weedy grass that's pretty predominant across the world. And, contrary to the folks on the Golf Channel that like to say Poa-anna, it is Poa annua.
Oh, okay.
And that's important. Gets all of us turf heads in a snit on Twitter when the Golf Channel folks mispronounce it.
Well, they make a few mistakes from time to time.
It's not a poor girl in Alabama. It's a grass called Poa annua, and it's related to Kentucky bluegrass, which is also a Poa pratensis. And Kentucky bluegrass was probably the most predominant grass on fairways in the northern climate for a very, very long time until bent grass kind of supplanted it. Bent grass tends to have more inputs required to maintain a quality fairway compared to Kentucky bluegrass, but it also provides for tighter, lower mowing heights, tighter lies, things like that, which is sometimes desirable. And in the South, the grass that has been predominant throughout, pretty much throughout the last 50 to 60 years is Bermuda grass. And whether it's a common Bermuda grass or it's a hybrid Bermuda grass, that's been the grass that's generally used on fairways. And then in the transition zone and in some areas of the South, there are some of the grasses that are from Asia called the zoysia grasses. And there's two different kinds of zoysia grasses. There's zoysia japonica, which is Japanese lawn grass, which is a coarser textured. And if you think of zoysia on fairways, most often that's the grass that we're talking about. And then there's another zoysia grass called Manila grass, which is Zoysia matrella, which is a much finer textured grass. It can be mowed very tight. And that's a grass that you see used at places like Atlanta Athletic Club and a number of golf courses in the Atlanta area. There's a few courses up here that have it on some tee tops, and you see it at Blue Jack National, Tiger Woods' new golf course there in Houston. You see some of the matrellas there. So there are a number of different species of grasses that can be used for fairways. And the push on fairways is more often than not towards, not unlike greens, towards lower mowing heights, tighter lies, with the idea that that's more fun. And I think that needs to be rethought as well.
More fun could be, and for some wedge play, for some people, that's not necessarily more fun. Right?
You see this, I'm sure, as a fitter, and I certainly see it as a player. I like tight lies like everybody else, but I'm a better player. But at the same time, I struggle off. It's not easy to hit quality shots off of tight lies. And in terms of hitting quality shots and having fun, having a little bit of forgiveness would be kind of nice.
Yeah.
And I actually really enjoy playing off of Zoysia fairways because I feel like I have that margin of error. And if I go through and look at my best scores, very often they came on golf courses where there were Zoysia fairways, and I had that little bit of margin of error that I could be aggressive with a shot and not have to pay for it by not hitting it just perfectly. And you see so much of the conversation with a lot of the teachers and coaches out there about working on your strike and where you hit it on the club face, and then how you contact the ground before or after the ball, hopefully after, and having that little bit of forgiveness in terms of how the turf is maintained would go a long way towards increasing the enjoyment and maybe reducing to some degree. It's not that golf isn't hard. That's one of my favorite sentences from Lowest Score Wins, the book by Dave Wedzik and Eric Boreski, is that golf is hard. And it is. But I think we do a lot in the turf business to try to maintain things like they're maintained oftentimes for the PGA Tour, when most of our players are nowhere near that level of capability, and that makes for a game that is doubly difficult.
Yeah. Well, that really moves us into the the third area too, because, and when I made up these questions, managing rough is more important, I think, than we probably give it credit for when we think about it. And, at different times of the year when I play, the rough can be really high. Sometimes in the summers in places, it can be really high and frustrating, and it can be difficult in places that you play to find the golf ball, right?
Yeah.
And so talk about some of the considerations, with rough and just in general, how to make it, playable but yet challenging, right? I mean, that's been a consistent theme throughout what we talked about.
Sure. And I think, there's a couple of schools of thought on rough in terms of how we're doing this in the modern era. One of the first things is that I think the U.S. Golf Association and other groups are doing a tremendous job of helping superintendents identify where golfers go on the golf course. So that allows for some kind of targeted maintenance, so that perhaps some areas where you just very rarely see a golfer ever present on the golf course, and they're doing this by tracking them with GPS and things like that. And that allows that superintendent to maybe let that grass grow much taller, more of a tall grass kind of setting where you might have some seed heads, and it might look a little more like what you might see over in the Scottish Isles during the Open Championship, and so there's some of that going on where we're actually taking areas out of play where we just very rarely see players there, and I think that's a good thing from a resource management standpoint. But from the rough that's in play, I think the real challenge is to maybe and this is one of these things that a membership and a superintendent at a golf course need to kind of have a conversation about, is what is it that they're looking to get out of their rough area. Because, you go places, think about Augusta National before they introduced the secondary cut. The golf course was maintained pretty much as 100% fairway height grass. There was no rough.
Yeah.
It was all through the green. And I know Sweetens Cove, I keep bringing that up, but I just played there and was just enamored with the place. And they have they maintain their entire mode area is maintained as fairway. And so you literally can play down multiple avenues to get to a hole depending on what your skill set is. And I think that's a wonderful approach The challenge often with golf courses that exist now, certainly the ones that were built during the big building boom of the 90s and early 2000s, is that they're in between houses. And so you have to have some way of delineating where the golf course is and where the lawns are, and you need to control golf balls from going too far afield and things like that. So I think there are some limitations to this idea, but like you mentioned, if you can play a round of golf and you don't lose very many golf balls, and you find the golf ball relatively easily, so you're not looking for it for your allotted 5 minutes or soon to be 3 minutes or whatever it is, and you're not holding up play in the process, and you're not, if you're a real stickler for the rules, maybe you didn't play a provisional and now you have to walk all the way back to the tee to hit a shot. If you don't have to do any of those things, the golf game becomes infinitely more fun. And to me, the focus needs to be on having fun and the golfer having fun, and not making it such a punishing endeavor that every time the golfer comes out and they spend a lot of their time in the rough, they lose a dozen golf balls. It costs them an extra $50 or $30 or $20 or whatever they spent on their golf balls. And they spend all their time traipsing around with cockleburs on their pants because they can't find their golf ball. And that's just no fun. And to me, the real key to good rough management is to recognize where those corridors are on the golf course, where players are having, maybe hitting the ball a little farther afield because they're using a longer club, and then trying to make those areas for daily play more receptive to those errant shots. Because the golfer, this is one of these things when I was working at a golf course, we had the opportunity to ask some questions of the architect. I'm not going to say where I was working or who the architect was, but there was a bunker that was behind a 1/2 acre bunker that was behind a kind of a peninsula green that stuck into this 1/2 acre bunker. And one of the folks on the management crew asked, what was your thought with the bunker that's behind there? Because it seems like the only person that's going to be back there is a player that doesn't need to have a bunker shot over another bunker to a green that runs away from them into another bunker. And his response was, well, I thought it looked kind of nice. And I think we need to be, like with rough management, we need to be a little more cognizant of not necessarily the aesthetic look all the time, but also cognizant of how it plays and how difficult is it. The average player, if you listen to some of the coaches, Andrew Rice and some of these other guys talking about, clean club faces and getting friction on the ball to spin it, they're already going to have a difficult enough time being just in slightly higher grass. So having something that's 6 inches and is just brutal to play from is no fun for anybody for daily play. Now, if you're going to host a once a year US Open style tournament, great. That's fine. That also can be fun. I played in the Golf Course Superintendents Association's golf tournament, which is quite a large undertaking. And when we were in San Diego, one of our championship courses was Torrey Pines North, and it was right after the Farmers tournament when they had the big storm that came in and knocked all the trees down a couple of years ago. And they were getting ready to do the redo of the North with Tom Weiskopf, so they weren't really maintaining it. And the rough was kikuyu grass, which is another grass that you find particularly out on the West Coast and then in places like Australia and whatnot. And kikuyu grass is like Bermuda grass, but it's like on steroids because it's woody and it's very difficult to play out of. And the kikuyu grass rough was about 7 inches tall. We had spotters on 15 of the 18 holes with the little flags like they do at the U.S. Open. And it was brutal. And it was a lot of fun, but I wouldn't want to do that on a daily basis.
Yeah.
And so it's just one of those where I think that's the conversation in terms of maintaining rough that we have to have, is that we need to have the conversation about let's not shoot ourselves in the foot and make the game any harder than it already is. Let's focus on making sure that it's fun.
I was. We probably don't have time to get into this question, but as you were talking, it made me wonder how much there needs to be more and more conversations between the architects and what you guys do. But let's move on to because that's a whole nother topic, right?
You better believe
that could really.
And I do think I will say just briefly that there's a number of architects today that are very conversant with their golf course superintendents about what's going to be able to be maintained after they're gone.
Yeah.
So I think there are some, but we definitely went through a stretch where it was more about the architect and less about the manageability of the golf course.
Yeah. Well, we started today, with your story about how a superintendent sort of got you into things, but I'm curious what the relationships typically are, for example, with the architects in the Knoxville area and you guys, and what's the sort of give and take? What do you feed to them that helps them? What do they feed to you that helps you in terms of information?
Yeah, that's a great question, Tony. I think the relationship that we have with golf course superintendents, and then, in terms of a turfgrass science and management research program, we're also looking at things for athletic field management. We have a large facility that looks at athletic field safety and the interaction of the athlete and the surface and the impact that surface might have on things like concussion and joint injuries and things like that. So I think, we're engaged across kind of the breadth of our industry. And this is true, pretty much across the board. But from a golf course perspective with the superintendents, I think our relationship with golf course superintendents and with others in our industry is really kind of twofold. The first one is that we're trying to generate knowledge and information based on science and data to allow them to make informed decisions about what they're going to do to manage their golf course as effectively as possible. So that's kind of our overarching goal. And then I think the second thing that we do with them is that we kind of function in a consultative role, whether we're actually formally serving as a consultant or we're serving an extension mission, which is something that the land-grant universities around the country serve, where one of our missions is to extend the knowledge that we develop to our professional fields that we represent. And so that's certainly one of the jobs that we have, is to function in that consultative role and say, when somebody is having a challenge or a problem, help them figure out what it is and then recommend some possible solutions. We never get involved, or we try not to get involved in the actual decision making. More often than not, we provide the options, and then it's up to the professional that's in charge of that facility to make those decisions. There are times where, and this is one of the things, again, for your listenership, that I think it's important to remember that, if you're at a place where maybe you're a little frustrated with the golf course superintendent and you think that they're to blame for the conditions or whatever, bringing in an outside source that is going to comment on those conditions without interacting directly with the person in charge of managing those services is a really bad idea. Yeah. It often leads to really bad outcomes. And so whenever I'm in a situation like that where somebody contacts me and says, hey, could you come look at this or that? If it's not the golf course superintendent, that's my first response, is I'm happy to come help and offer my expertise, but I will only do that if I have the opportunity to interact with your superintendent. Because I think, you see the commercials on Golf Channel, thank a superintendent. We've got National Golf Day, I think might be today. I can't remember if it's today or tomorrow, but this week, up on Capitol Hill, where folks from the golf industry are representing golf. And then you've got, coming up here in a week or so, we've got the Rounds for Research auction coming up which is an auction, and I'll get you a link that you can put in the show notes, where golf courses donate rounds, and we're talking golf courses that are places that a lot of people, if you're not a member, you won't be able to play. You can bid on those rounds, and the proceeds from those rounds goes towards helping fund some of the research that we do. And I think that's kind of neat. Yeah, that's a great thing, and it's a really good opportunity if something like that interests you. To there's a number of golf courses here in Tennessee, and then all over the country that are some pretty nice spots that you could have an opportunity to bid on and maybe go play and experience some of those places. And so those are kind of the two main roles, is that consultative role and then doing the research to help answer it. So then the second part of your question is, how do we learn from them? And I think, or what do we get from them? The thing that we get from the turf managers in the various fields, in which we serve, I think mostly is, they're a group of really solid professionals that have this background of information, and then they're practicing this art based on a science to produce these wonderful surfaces that we get to play on. And for me, the thing that I get from them most is I often get questions that spur me to want to do more research, more looking at a particular question. And I think that's the thing that I get most from them, along with, there's some of my best friends are golf course superintendents, and you have a real appreciation for the time and effort that it takes. And so again, like I said, you see those Golf Channel commercials about thank a superintendent. It's very true. It's wonderful to thank the golf course superintendent at the facility that you play at and recognize the effort that it takes. And most people don't realize that what you see on TV is often the product of literally hundreds of golf course superintendents that have volunteered their time to go help the host superintendent put together a facility that's ready for play at the highest level. And that's something that doesn't often get seen until there's a problem, or, fortunately for us, until somebody hits the side of the hole like they did at Augusta.
That was interesting.
And everybody got to see how a cup is changed. It's one of those things that most people don't see, because the goal of the golf course superintendent, and really athletic field managers as well, is to never be part of the conversation.
That's right.
You want that surface to be there and playable, and then that's the last thing. You don't want to be out in the forefront, because generally when you're out in the forefront, it's not a good place to be.
Well, That has been really fascinating today, Brandon. Thanks a lot. So how about a few final takeaways then that you want golfers to remember related to turf grass, and also, any things that can give them a little edge in shooting lower scores?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Tony. It's been a really wonderful conversation, and I've enjoyed it very much. The final thing that I would just mention is, and you've had some other episodes. I listened to your podcast as well, and you've had some other episodes where folks have talked about talent and skill, and recognizing how, for lack of a better term, how good is. And I think it's one of the things that I think golfers would do better. And maybe even shoot some lower scores, is if they would be a little more reflective and open about their skill and ability, and not necessarily by good or bad standards, but by where they're at on the journey to from PGA Tour to rank beginner. Where are they at on that continuum? Because for example, you'll hear people get all up in arms about when an important management practice that we just briefly touched on it at the beginning, and I'll just come back to it as kind of my final comment: aerification. So golf courses in most places need to aerify twice per year if they have cool season greens, and very often if they have warm season greens, they're going to need to aerify sometime in the summer to manage a number of different factors associated with the putting surface, but it's a critically important management practice that superintendents take an endless amount of grief from.
Yeah.
And often that relates to the ball bouncing around and putting quality, getting bad when it was just starting to get good, because that's right when the grass is most actively growing, which is when you want to do this important practice. And I found myself, and I've done a little bit of research on this, and it's kind of a continuing project for me, but it's fascinating to me that when you look at where a ball rolls out if you use a device like the Perfect Putter or a stimp meter to roll balls out on an aerified surface, the balls all end up in pretty much the same location. And so you'll have golfers complaining and wanting to go to other places to play because the greens have been punched and so on. And if they would be a little bit more reflective about what it is that they're actually doing and realize that, for example, and I'm just looking at the baseline numbers here. So 33 feet is the PGA Tour baseline for two putting. They one putt 6% of the time, they three putt 6% of the time, and they two putt 88% of the time. And at 8 feet is their benchmark number for making 50% of their putts. And so you have golfers that will complain that somewhere between that, 8 feet, and that's a PGA Tour player.
Yeah, right.
An average PGA Tour player, making those putts. And you'll have somebody at a local golf course complaining that they didn't make their 27-footer because it was bouncing all over the place. And I think it's important to remember to maybe just be a little more reflective on the fact that management practice and management practices in general, not just aerification, but other management practices are important for maintaining that healthy surface, which is what we led off with. And recognize that, if you're 35 or 40 feet away, you're probably going to two putt anyway. So just give it a roll down there, let it bounce around a little bit, and might bounce into the hole. So just, be a little more open to the idea that some of these management practices are important, and that the superintendent, often a player themselves, is doing this because it's critically important to making sure that the surfaces are healthy and playable for long periods of time and well into the future. So, that's what I would leave off with. And thanks again for, having the opportunity to talk to a new group of people for me, because I'm sure not many of the folks are superintendents. They're probably golfers like me, and having a little bit of perspective of somebody from inside the industry might be helpful. So thanks again for providing me with the opportunity, Tony.
Well, thanks, Brandon. It was very fascinating. Now I've put in a link to the UT site in the show notes, but I'm going to get you to send me that other link right away, and I'll make sure I modify the show notes to put that in it too. But thanks again for doing this with me.
Yeah, thank you, Tony.
Taking your game to new heights. www.gameimprovementgolf.com.
Well, Brandon, thanks for sharing that fascinating information with us today about what you do and how it relates to the sport that we all love. To learn some more about what Dr. Brandon Horvath does at the University of Tennessee Department of Turfgrass Science and Management Program, see the link in the show notes. Before I end today, I want to make sure that you take a look at the new tagline that I put at the end of my podcast publication, and that I'll be putting at the end of my blog post now. This tag is, "Thanks to my good friend, Russ Ryden." Well, that's it for today, and hopefully I'll be back in full voice for my next interview, which I will be doing in about 2 weeks. See you then.
Game Improvement Golf, your source of information and inspiration to become an exceptional golfer now. www.gameimprovementgolf.com